Do you think that we are getting away from capitalism as a society?
The U.S. society,
The
or
US society and just the bigger society of the world. I mean, you're talking about how, like, we're trying to get away from the capitalist mindset. Do you think that is happening?
I think that the current moment is characterized by an inability to resolve capitalist crises, combined with a very clear emergence of what many people call a multipolar world. And the multipolar world, meaning a world in which there is not a unipolar dominance by US capitalism or US style capitalism, is a world that is characterized, amongst other things, by very clear leadership on the part of China. China is a socialist country. And in that regard, many people see, and I think that this is a correct analysis, the multipolar world is a way of breaking up US driven imperialism in order to create more space for the flourishing and further development of socialism. So, in the broad kind of world historical perspective, I do see advances being made on the front of imperialism not being able to maintain the forms of hegemony that it had in the past, or partial hegemony because it was never complete, and an increasing development of socialism or socialistically oriented forms of governance around the world. In the case of the US, it's a little bit more complicated, given that it's the leading empire and that it has arguably one of the most reactionary political cultures around the world. I do think that there is a very strong presence of an interest in socialism, particularly amongst young people. And this has been statistically proven, right? If you look at various polls about whether or not people identify as socialist or even communist, they've been going up. And so I do think that within the US context, there's a lot of interest on the part of the youth and also just other disenfranchised populations with opening up the spectrum of analysis beyond the kind of boomer ideology and engaging seriously with socialism, and a lot more socialist activism going on, which I take it to be a net positive.
Would you consider yourself an optimist?
Optimism and pessimism often tend to relate to kind of, how to put it, psychological states. And
Okay.
I'm much more in favor of objective analysis as much as possible, right? The only way of making it an objective analysis is through the point of view of a subject, of course.
Sure.
But often if one thinks only, oh, I'm an optimist or I'm a pessimist, one is thinking subjectively about how I orient myself in relationship to the world. So I would say that I'm an objective optimist in the sense that, objectively speaking, I do not see the possibility of the capitalist system continuing to maintain itself over time. And that we're in a world now where I think it's very clear that it's the end of capitalism or the end of us, right? Either through nuclear apocalypse or through the ecological collapse, or some other horrific version of World War III without nukes or something like this, but something rather horrific. And that in that regard, the socialist project that has been struggling in fits and starts to emerge since 1917, at least in material form, is a project that is going to continue to galvanize, and I would anticipate increasingly galvanize people. But we have to look at that in a global perspective, because at the same time, what you clearly have within capitalist countries, particularly within the imperialist core, is a resurgence of fascism. And so with the crises of capitalism and the inability on the part of the ruling class to take care of these crises, because they're irresolvable ultimately, the propagandists, as well as the capitalist ruling class, have a well-known, tried and true solution to that. And that is to try to do a kind of bait and switch where they bait people into various fascist forms of politics that ultimately have the goal of shoring up the capitalist system and intensifying imperialism. And so in the US context, we also have very powerful fascist organizations, and we have a government and a capitalist ruling class that either work hand in glove with the fascists or at least accommodate and maintain their presence because they always want to keep their bogeyman kind of on call for when push comes to shove and they need to crush the socialist alternative by any means necessary.
When you say fascist, like who would you define as the fascist organizations?
Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, the militia movement, the White Power movement, the Klan, of course, the deep history of one of the things that's interesting is when the Italian fascists first arrived on the scene, and then the term fascism was introduced into the English language via the Italian language. Many in the U.S. recognized that the Italian fascists were simply a European version of the Klan because they were pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, anti-socialist, and they were doing the vigilante work that was allowed by the government, when we're talking about the black shirts, for instance, in the exact same way that the KKK was often allowed to act with impunity on the part of organizations like the FBI or the police or other forms of law enforcement within the United States. And so I think there is a very well documented history of fascist organizations. The thing that's, I think, difficult but important to analyze is that fascism comes in many different forms. It's not just swastikas and jackboots. We have plenty of that. Look at the Ukraine or look elsewhere, or in the United States. Plenty of people with swastika tattoos here. But given that fascism often takes on ultra-nationalist forms, Dimitrov, the famous communist analyst of fascism, claimed that when fascism arrives in the United States, it will arrive draped in the American flag and singing hymns to patriotism, right? It'll all be about U.S. exceptionalism, et cetera. It'd be MAGA, Make America Great Again, right?
Yeah.
And so in that regard, there is a very important fascist movement in the United States. And in the wake of January 6th, with Biden coming into office, there was not a serious crackdown on these organizations. There was a kind of propaganda campaign and a need to at least do something. And so you have some of the heads of these organizations who just recently received prison terms going up to, I believe, between 15, maybe 18 years is the maximum sentence, which is about half of what the prosecutors were seeking. And the organizations have not been shut down and continue to operate, even though some of the leadership has run into some legal problems. So it's alive and well in the United States for sure. And a real danger, of course, to socialist organizing, because one of the main goals of fascism is to crush the real opponents of capitalism, who are the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, anyone basically who's on the hard left.
So in the electoral realm, then, I mean, those groups you name, I mean, they are, very much like wearing it on the sleeve. Literally, in most cases, they usually have some sort of decor on their sleeves. But you know, getting into the electoral realm, like I would say, I consider Ron DeSantis a straight up Nazi. I think that guy is the most dangerous person in American politics, second to none. If he were to ever enter the White House, I've already talked to my wife about it. I want to get out of this country as soon as we safely can. Trump, I think Trump's just a freaking narcissist who has like no ideology whatsoever. Not saying he isn't dangerous. I just think he's just a narcissistic loon. And then getting into the other side of it, I mean, it's like you look at a lot of fascistic, by definition, policies that are pushed by corporate Democrats like Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. So do you think there's any alternative right now in the electoral realm?
Not amongst the Democrats and the Republicans, because I couldn't
Mhm.
agree more that if you want to analyze fascism, you have to do it internationally. And you see this very clearly with the US undying support for what is basically a totalitarian regime in the Ukraine controlled by Zelensky, and the funding of fascist battalions that have been this funding has, and the battalions themselves has been extremely well documented. And so regardless of whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican who comes into office, US imperialism and the US support of fascism internationally will continue, right? So that's a negative. Regarding fascism domestically, I think that we have to, and George Jackson's a great analyst on this front, identify at least two different forms of fascism. One is just the nature of the US police state and the mass incarceration system, everything that goes into the kind of quote unquote legal fascism. And that will continue unabated. Again, whether or not it's a Democrat or a Republican, we see this very clearly with Biden's longstanding history of supporting racist policies, being involved in the mass incarceration system, et cetera, et cetera. The fascist movements are a third element to that, like the movements that were empowered by Trump that I mentioned a moment ago. If Trump, someone like DeSantis, comes into office, then we are looking at a significant uptick in that type of activity. And that means that I think it would be increasingly dangerous for various forms of organizing, whether or not it be, labor organizing or social movement organizing or other such things within the US context. And it also depends on what exactly that will look like over time, because fascists historically have come into, like full-blooded fascists have come into office largely as opportunists who have been bankrolled by the capitalist ruling class, or segments of the capitalist ruling class, who are looking to solve the problem of how to increase capitalist accumulation and beat back the socialist threat. And it's clear within the US context that there are segments of the capitalist ruling class that support a kind of fascist option, a more directly fascist option, in the sense of supporting presidential candidates that would support these fascist movements and potentially also increase the two other forms of fascism that I mentioned, both imperialist fascism and the kind of fascist police state. And so one of the conundrums right now, I think, for some of the capitalist ruling class is what to do when faced with the fact that you do have an empire that is facing various forms of decadence, meaning various ways in which it's kind of coming apart at the seams. How do you shore that up? Well, one of them is you look at historical examples and you follow them. And in fact, in 1934, this is exactly what a group of Democrats did who were anti-FDR. They collaborated with JP Morgan and a whole series of other members of the capitalist ruling class and they made plans for a fascist coup d'etat, in which they studied Hitler, Mussolini, and examples of fascism within France. And we now know through the business plot, this is all part of the public record, that there was a conspiracy to establish a fascist dictatorship. That was the term that was used within the United States. And so we shouldn't think by any stretch of the imagination that somehow we're immune to these types of politics.
So staying in the electoral realm for just a minute, and I don't want to harp on it too long, but can third parties build power in the United States, and if so, how?
Well, the whole system is set up to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? And we've seen time and again the way in which we don't have a true democracy in the United States. We have an oligarchic republic that is controlled by the capitalist ruling class and that tries to ensure that any party formation that would be on the side of the people is completely excluded from the possibility of power and even from public debate. Right now, of course, we'll see what happens with the most recent, I think, probably most prominent instantiation thereof, and that is Cornel West now running for the Green Party, right? Mm-hmm. Cornel West is a social democrat who is dedicated to certain progressive positions that are markedly different than anything that we see on the part of the Democrats and the Republicans. He was involved in the Sanders campaign, has his, critiques to the left of Sanders. He also is a believer and can mobilize a kind of Christian base in a very, very interesting way. The Democratic Party has already started, as we saw with Sanders' positions and whatnot, what is sure to be one of the most heinous slander campaigns against West, probably in the history of electoral politics. And so we'll see how this plays out. I assume, I'm not privy to and part of these internal discussions, of course, although I did have the pleasure of interviewing Cornel West years ago. I assume that one of the main reasons that he's running is not based on the assumption that the Green Party can get on enough ballots in enough states to actually be able to vote him into office, but so that he can occupy a position that can hopefully help change part of the conversation in the United States, like the Sanders campaign, for all of its ultimate failings, did in various ways, because it made socialism into something that was no longer a bad word. And so in that regard, I think that West's contributions, we'll see how they play out, are promising for, at a minimum, changing the nature of the conversation. And we'll see perhaps more than that. But I think we have to remain, cautiously, optimistic in the sense of the objective optimism that I was talking about. We have to look at the actual extant play of forces. And it would be quite surprising if West was able to be voted into office.
Do you think the left as a whole is in a better place than it was prior to 2016, or in a worse one?
The left in electoral politics,
Just big
in
picture.
general?
Yeah, activism, electorally, just domestically, but, kind
Yeah.
of big picture domestically.
It's a good question. I mean, I think we're going through a serious moment of transition in which the two Sanders campaigns, I think, have demonstrated to a lot of people that electoral change is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, within the US context, because then also you have the consequences of, Trump's presidency and now Biden's presidency, both of which I find catastrophic for working people. And so I think that there is an increasing both interest in leftism and political mobilization around leftist causes. At the same time, there is a lack of viable infrastructure in the sense of developed parties, unions, a kind of culture of the left, which you do have. I spent a lot of time in France, and you have that in a country like France, where you have, even on TV shows, you have people debating politics, and there are Marxists who are on TV. Of course, you'd never have that on CNN or anything like that. And so one of the most important struggles is to build up that infrastructure so that we have much more cultural, political, labor-based infrastructure for a kind of culture of the left. And I do think that we're headed in that direction. I think there are some very positive signs on that front. I also think that reality is on our side. One of the great quotes from Michael Parenti that I often reference is, he said, the problem with the ruling class that they've always had is that reality is radical, because reality makes people radical. Reality is homelessness and downward mobility and stagnant wages and all the shit that working class people have to deal with. And given that reality is radical, people are increasingly looking for and getting involved in alternative modes of organizing, and that's extremely promising. And that's one of the reasons that there's so much propaganda being pumped out, both in order to try to funnel people into the Democratic Party and its machine, or further to the right, simply to funnel people into fascist modes of organizing through all the anti-China propaganda, all the anti-Russia propaganda, and things like this. And it's another reason that we need a real kind of cultural power in order to direct people in a different direction, to identify who their real enemies are. The real enemies aren't Russians or Chinese people. The real enemies are the capitalist ruling class, who are producing propaganda that are telling them that the Russians and the Chinese are the real enemies, or the Mexican immigrants, or, there's lots of other potential enemies, the black people, et cetera, et cetera.